I feel we have not a lot to teach, but also a lot to learn. We have layers of memories and layers of expectations ahead of us. So we look forward to your reflection on these thoughts, and please welcome your speech.
So thank you to the organizers and to our audience, to the rest of you for this invitation. So a few words about my background in relation to my brief reflections. So I'm professor of philosophy here in Stockholm. I work mostly on questions of time and history and tradition and how we inhabit the space of the Riksbankens Jubileumsfond for 6 years. In the context of that project, I published myself a book that came out with Stanford University Press a couple of years ago that's called Being with the Dead, with the subtitle Burial, Ancestral Politics and the Roots of Historical Consciousness. And I will have a few things to say towards the end about this idea of being with the dead and how this also is perhaps of relevance to your topic here. But I'd like first to say a few words in relation to the sort of the general ethos of this conference that has to do with the hope of rebuilding and looking towards the future, and the kind of discourse that this activates is, of course, a discourse of the future. And today we are accustomed to speak of this in terms of sustainable future, which is a sort of the framework of our contemporary discourse. But I myself like to place also a parallel concept on the table that I've tried to elaborate a little bit in my. I also collaborate with the restoration program at the Royal Art Institute here in Stockholm. And in the recent years, we have tried to start talking about also sustainable past, because I think it's in relation to this sort of evolutionist and progressivist way of thinking that dominates our culture. It's also important to think, what does it mean to inhabit the past? What does it mean to cultivate and care for the past in a sustainable way? So I invite you also to think about this idea of a sustainable past and not just the future. We talk about memory. Memory has become an increasingly important topic in the cultural sciences, which is, I think, very logical, because memory is a fascinating concept to think about. It's both subjective and very objective. If it was not for the memory that we carry, all of us, inside our bodies, inside our minds, we would all be living in a kind of presentist nightmare where everything would just sort of flicker past and nothing would have any meaning except the immediate sensation. So the memory that we have and that we have as human conscious beings is what, in a sense, preserves the art of history within each and every one of us as also a shared space and sharing memory. But this, you can say, is the subjective aspect of memory. But memory is also very much something objective, and it has to do precisely with your art, the art of architecture. Because if we look at the original word for memory, mneme in Greek, it's both a name for precisely what we think about, that's the memories that we have, but it's also another name for the monument, or in its most concrete form, the grave, the memorial. So memory is always both exterior and interior. As we shape the physical space and the way that we cultivate the physical space that we inhabit, we are also, as it were, constructing the memorial landscape in which we move. This is described very beautifully by the author, which I think is the most quoted author when it comes to the discussion of culture of memory today, Maurice Halbwachs, who was a French scholar who lived in the mid-war period. And he describes the framework of memory is his term. And he speaks also in one of his books of how he's walking through a city landscape and how the actual architectural structure of the city is almost what carries and keeps the memory. So the memories are not, they are activated in him as he moves there, but they are actually coming from the space in which he moves. So as we create spaces to inhabit, we also create and preserve memory. And there is no way that we can separate the objective from the subjective in this work that we do as also cultivators of the physical space. This is, of course, an acute question now that you are all facing, who would be involved in the reconstruction of this partly destroyed society, about whether to build anew and whether to reconstruct, which was, of course, the great question that many of the nations in Europe faced after the Second World War. And we know the different examples, the large-scale projects in order to simply recreate something new, the progressivist idea. There were the antiquarian choices, where the Polish example is perhaps the most famous one. But I would, from my perspective, also stress, especially in relation to the general ethos of politicians and many technicians, of sort of wanting to go ahead to move into the future, but really also think about this. What does it mean to preserve an historical space in terms of also preserving a historical memory, which is so important for a culture that wants to retrieve its sense of balance and history. So caring for old destroyed buildings, also caring for the techniques with which they were built, is not just an antiquarian and retrograde mindset. It's also taking responsibility for the shaping of public memory as a way of moving into the future. In one of the, I think, most, for me, inspiring, important philosophical books when it comes to thinking about the past and the shape of the past is a book that some of you will have heard about. It's a famous book that was published in the early 90s by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. He was responding to the analysis by the American political science Fukuyama, who claimed after '89 that now we have the end of history and everything will now progress according to the plan of liberal democracy. That Fukuyama was wrong, we know with painful clarity now. But in his argument against Fukuyama, Jacques Derrida wrote a book that's called The Spectres of Marx, where he's comparing an analysis of Marx and Shakespeare and Hamlet. And his main point in that book is that the progressivist idea of history of something simply moving ahead, forward, leaving behind what's done, he says, is completely wrong. Because time, he says, moves in much more complicated circles, and time is a question of return, where the old, especially the old that has not been processed and laid to rest, will return. So he speaks of a haunting history, he speaks of a spectral history, he speaks of a history of ghostly returns. And I think that image, that metaphor, has been hugely important for people who have tried to think about what it is we are experiencing in the last 20, 25 years. I think especially in relation to the development of Russia in its post-Soviet experiences. And if you want to read one very good book about this, I would recommend the sort of very Derridian Russian social scientist and psychoanalysis, Alexander Etkin, who published a book 6-7 years ago that's called Warped Morning, and it describes the landscape of the Russian mental society after its inability to deal with its own haunting memories of murders, deportations, these wars these sort of butchery of the war, the inability even to retrieve the dead. And you get a kind of sense of the mental landscape written from inside a brilliant Russian analysis of how you can create a society where besides a society of vampires and zombies and returns, where people are looking for the dead everywhere, but they are nowhere taken care of. And a society that cannot grieve and that cannot relate to its own death and its own losses will be a society which will become violent and unpredictable, and it will react in an irrational way. So I think in that sense, Etkin's book is also a kind of premonition of what we are seeing today, of a destroyed psychic landscape that has to do with the inability to care for their own dead and their own disasters. And this leads me now to my last point that I also want to toss out in relation to the initial comment about whether or not to look to the future or look to the past when we are looking at questions of reconstructing a society. Because of course the huge task for everybody involved now in the rebuilding of Ukraine is simply the restoring of a destroyed infrastructure. But it's, I think, also important to think about how can this society in its architectonic, artistic and technological practices already now prepare itself for how to care for all the people who have died in the process of hopefully preserving the society as a free nation. That is, how can the dead be cared for in terms of how the public space is construed? On a very elementary level, and in everybody's mind is, of course, burial of the dead, caring for the bodies, the sort of the immediate care of the bodies that is of such importance in a war. But just creating an individual grave and a place where one family can grieve is only the first immediate step. A society which is traumatized in the way that this society is also needs to think in terms of public spaces. How can the grief, how can the loss, how can the memory of all those people who have disappeared or who have sacrificed, how can that be somehow built in to these new city landscapes? And in relation to that task, we have many, I think, interesting experience to look at. We all know what it means to travel in the small villages of Europe who after the First World War tried to make architectural sense of the huge loss. All of these little monuments to the lost soldier, the soldier that populate all of the European landscape. Now it's a kind of archaeology of memorials. Also the Second World War, but I'm thinking of the experience of former Yugoslavia and the way that I think also in other modern tragedies, such as the attempt in some attempts in America to sort of to deal with its own many failed war experiences, where artists and architects can collaborate in order to think in new ways. How can we create public spaces, monuments, but maybe new kind of monuments, where somehow this experience of the tragic past can be preserved as something that can also be collectively experienced. And I think South Africa is also an interesting experience, how some architects in collaboration with artists came in right after '94, after the transition, and also created some very interesting examples of how you can work with architecture explicitly as a way of articulating a relation to a traumatizing past. So I just invite you and all of us also to contemplate that direction, because what we are doing when we are rebuilding an urban landscape is not only restoring material culture, but shaping or giving shape to time itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes before our lunch. We have gone through our program with some haste, so we actually have a few minutes to reflect. So I would like to invite anyone who has a comment in the room, but also by Zoom. And Per Mikael, you will help us to sort of invite our voices outside of Färgfabriken. You bring up the question of memories and the difference between the objective and the subjective. And that it's not only an antiquarian question of preserving objects from the past, but that they hold within our common history, and they are also sort of a public space, like, and memories like books. I mean, that would remind us of our history, but also of our mistakes. And I think this brings up a very a question of not only architecture, but our whole topic here today. So if anyone would like to comment, or, yeah, please.
Thank you for a great speech. And I'm from Sarajevo, so I can relate to this. Thank you talking about using public space to revive memories. Like we had an art project called Sarajevo Red Line, when you put 11,000 red chairs, all people being killed in Sarajevo during the war. It meant much more than every politician speaking about the war trauma or things like that, because people were coming there, putting flowers, small notes, and it was like a kind of healing, and it's very, very important. Just a reflection.
You have some thoughts?
No, but I'm happy you mentioned that. I've heard about this, I read about this project. And I think also it's good that you stress the fact that this is a collaboration. It's an artistic project, but it's a way of sort of bringing art out into the public space. And I think it's some of the most sort of interesting such initiatives, I think, comes about when you can have a dialogue exactly between artists working, because as artists, people think in a little different mindset. I mean, architects are artists, but artists are sort of more oriented towards productive goals. And I think that dialogue is very important to keep, especially when it comes to relating to questions of temporal and memorial experiences, because there's something about the artistic training that the example you raise is beautiful in that respect. And there are many initiatives that have been done in former Yugoslavia, right? In terms also of trying to heal conflict in the sense of and this is also going to happen. I mean, now we are in the battle zone, and the things are very the lines are very sharp between friend and enemy. But if this is going to become a future, you would also have to think in terms of what kind of shared memories can be created on the basis of this ongoing catastrophe. And I think also in relation to those challenges, artistic practices will be important.
And they also mediate as an invitation for non-architects and non-artists to participate in something very mutual or subjective, but important. It's I think at Oleg's speech was also about this topic, about invitation on common grounds. And sometimes we need to be provoked, sometimes in a nice way and sometimes in a harsh way. And there, I think the artists have another role than architects, but we share this part of invitation to the public space. And so I think this is very important to keep that space and to keep it open and invite participation. Helena, well, we have, you have to help us here.
Yes, Carl-Henrik Barnekow wants to say something.
Please.
Yes, thank you. Caroline, I think you said a very good thing here about the mediation, about what an architect can help with here. As I see it from my outside perspective from Ukraine, previously I was in Stockholm, now I'm sitting in Skopje, North Macedonia, a country which is also a part that slipped away the war conflict when Yugoslavia broke up. I see now, when I look at Ukraine, there are so many different of memories. We have to work with the utter sheer destruction of cities and villages today. We have to work with the people who are being murdered today as we speak here. At the same time, we have the memories of people who have left their homes, maybe relocated within Ukraine, maybe located outside of Ukraine. There's like several here that in the reconstruction and rebuild that Ukraine will go through, we can work with that and use the public space to memorize that, somehow let these take places, and it takes in so many different layers. So I think it's really interesting to hear this, and also like in Kharkiv, the open space here, how we work in the school, like school spaces, like what will happen with how that can be a trigger point to create and strengthen the awareness, because we have a lot of memories that will come here, tragic.
Maybe we lost
maybe as a springboard to create a stronger Ukraine.
Does anyone in the room have a comment or? Yes, please.
Comments giving the attention again to the role of the architects and mediator. Of course, because we are talking about the war in Yugoslavia and not in Ukraine. So we already see the different approaches to commemorate the tragedy on the different levels in the society. So the state policy and how they see it, and the local communities. So it's and the actual local communities in different parts of the country. This part which really survived occupation, and this part which wasn't touched. So and this. Also different layers, different approach, different discussion, and also big tensions, because this different meaning and approaches to have to commemorate, and especially this very important issue is how to mediate this different approach from the state position to make it just very glorified and very, very visible, and local community, which sometimes want to bring more intentions through very sensitive way and not visible way, because it's tell actually more than such monuments. So and actually here the role of architects who can not only offer but also to mediate this discussion, you know, to come to such agreement to make this place a place of reconciliation of this memory, but not tensions of different feeling and meaning. So it's very important.
Yeah, the part of critical rethinking and not thinking that not relying on that we have an answer, but actually we have to find a new answer, and we can use parts of our history or common memories as keys to this, but they will not give us the full answer, of course. Christer, du har en kommentar.
I'm just listening and kind of reflecting on your really interesting speech. I think I'm always defending the importance of spaces. Always when we are planning. There are tendencies to privatize the public spaces, and what you are saying, there's one reason, one more important reason between the public spaces. And it could be easier. Walking around in Berlin, you can see some signs on the pathways where the Berlin Wall has been, and you can go to the Museum of the Holocaust, which is one of the strongest things I ever been into. So I mean, the importance of art and planning together in the public spaces. We come back to that. I mean, the role of architecture and cooperating with our artists is so important. I think it was really good speech. Thank you so much.
And it should be easy for us. I admire your, when you were talking about public spaces for culture in Ukraine.
У нас вже є така ситуація. Справа в тому, що у нас студенти...
We have a situation like this, that we have students.
Наш студент загинув, він пішов добровольцем, і на початку війни він загинув.
We had a student who in the beginning was like voluntarily went to war and died.
Я розумію, що прийде час, коли нам треба буде якось його пам'ять про нього зафіксувати.
And I know that the time will come that we already now need to think about how to fixate the memory of the student.
Він мав би захищати диплом бакалавра, але
he was about to take a degree, a bachelor degree, but he just passed away.
Вже зараз знімаються фільми, передачі про нього.
We have already different companies that make films and different programs about his life.
І я буду відверто, для мене це питання, як це зробити?
And for me, it's a question, how should I do it? How should we do it in our academy?
Тому що загинув він один, але ще є ті, хто воюють зараз.
Because he is the only student that passed away, died now, but there are other students who are on the battlefields.
Це і викладачі, і студенти.
Both students and teachers of the academy.
І буде дійсно велике питання, як зберегти оцю пам'ять і не перейти на той рівень радянський, так пострадянський, коли ставились монументи солдатам, соцреалізм такий був. Як зробити?
And that's why the question for us now, how to preserve the memory of him and not just go on this level of post-Soviet time that you just put a monument to unknown soldier, but how to create a memory specifically for him and memorize.
Тому що, на жаль, пам'ять у людей ще збереглася, і вони бачать, що іменно саме так треба робити.
Because the memory is still working from the past, and that's how they dictate, this is how should we do.
І тут потрібен діалог як всередині нашого суспільства. Ми вдячні, що ви підняли таке питання.
And that's why we are very thankful that you raised this question, because the really internal dialogue inside of our society is needed to be raised.
Yeah, this is one of the most burning topics, of course, how to honor in our time, but also to bring the memories into the future and not to repeat sort of empty gestures from the past.
Det är ganska bra. Vi har 4 minuter kvar för en publikfråga till.
So one question, we will have room for one question before we have a lunch break.
Det kanske någon från internet.
Please help us with that.
I would like to hear something from Urbanina for Anastasia or Gustav. Alexander, you must close your mic. Do we have Urbanina with us here? They don't hear me.
Do we have Urbalina in the room? Would you like to say something? You have been working on his handbook for rebuilding. Have you followed our discussion here?
Yes, but sorry, I have like no prepared lecture about.
No, I know, because I've invited you for the next seminar, but it was nice you could show up already this time. So this is a seminar format, so it's just a discussion, a conversation. So you're welcome with your spontaneous reflections.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we have like a little explanation about our work. With other 50 experts from Ukraine, we made the Urban Recovery Guide. So like right now we are ready to make the real book from our research and our book, and also making the translation in English. Like the main idea of this Urban Recovery Guide is like make something like IKEA catalog of the best decisions to put them in the Ukrainian reality. And but we see this process of Ukraine recovery not only about making our cities to look like they were before the war, but to make them more futuristic maybe, because we have this opportunity that we can make cities from scratch. So we just try to make the instrument for not only for Ukrainian architects, but also for foreign architects, try to experiment in Ukraine to try to make this idea, this future cities with all the ideas that we have in our minds about how our cities should look like. And maybe the main idea why we are trying to do this is that the Ukrainian cities will be the biggest ground for buildings in the whole Europe. So we all, not only Ukrainians, have this possibility to try our best ideas, our best architectural and practices here. It could be really important not only for Ukraine recovery, but also for European possibilities to make better cities. Sorry, I don't know if I put the right words in this presentation, is connected to the topic, but it is our ideas in short terms about our Urban Recovery Guide.
Thank you. We will come back.